At 70 years old, Margaret Thomas had outlived her husband, raised 3 children, and experienced nearly every stage of life, from the joy of young love to the hardship of loss. But what surprised most people who met her wasn't her age or her history. It was how vibrant she still was, how deeply satisfied she seemed, and how she radiated peace. Margaret lived in a cozy town in Vermont, in a quiet house just off the lake, with her dog Rufus and shelves full of books she had collected over the years. She spent her mornings tending to her garden and her evenings wrapped in a quilt, sipping tea by the fire. But the part of Margaret's life that was the most unexpected, at least to her children and friends, was how genuinely content she was with herself, even in bed. Now, this wasn't the kind of satisfaction people whisper about in hushed tones. It wasn't about scandal or secrets. It was about something far deeper, something that no one really tells you about growing older. When Margaret was in her 40s, intimacy was still about performance. It was about doing things right, being attractive, keeping the spark alive. But as the years passed, and especially after her husband Richard died from a sudden stroke, she began to realize that the greatest form of satisfaction wasn't in grand gestures or candlelit dinners. It was in stillness, in comfort, in being fully known and still fully accepted. Years later, Margaret found herself lying in bed one night, the air cool and the room silent except for the soft breathing of Rufus curled at her feet. She smiled, not because someone was next to her, but because she finally loved being with herself. That, to her, was satisfaction. It hadn't always been this way. After Richard passed, Margaret went through a long period of grief and loneliness. Her children, Anna, David, and Claire, called often and visited when they could, but it wasn't the same as coming home to a warm body, someone who knew your rhythms and moods. There were moments when she wondered if she would ever feel love again, or even desire. One winter, her daughter Anna gifted her a journal. On the front cover it read, "Write what sets your soul on fire." It sat unused for weeks until one sleepless night, Margaret opened it and began to write, not about what she missed, but about what she still wanted. What did she want at 70? Not a man, necessarily. Not flowers or flirtation. She wanted laughter, connection, touch, but not always physical. A meaningful touch could be a long conversation over soup, or someone brushing a strand of hair from her face. Satisfaction had transformed into something deeper. Eventually, Margaret joined a local book club and through it, met Harold, a retired school principal with a shy smile and a love for poetry. Harold was kind, soft-spoken, and not in a hurry for anything. Over time, their friendship grew. They walked together in the afternoons, often holding hands, sharing memories of years gone by. It wasn't electric in the way romance novels describe. It was grounded, tender, and filled with the kind of intimacy that takes time to develop. The first time Harold stayed over at Margaret's home, it was after they had both gotten caught in a rainstorm during a hike. They laughed like teenagers as they stripped off their soaked jackets and boots. That night, he offered to sleep on the couch, but Margaret, after a long pause, asked, "Would you like to share the bed? Just for warmth." Harold nodded, his face lighting up. And so, they lay there, side by side, fully clothed, beneath the quilt Richard once wrapped around her shoulders. There were no fireworks, no rush. Just the slow rise and fall of two people breathing in sync. That night, Margaret realized something extraordinary. What satisfied her now wasn't lust. It wasn't about being desired in the way society talks about. It was about emotional closeness, about being seen and respected. It was about someone sharing a space with her without needing to change her, fix her, or awaken anything dormant. Her satisfaction came from the feeling that she was safe, valued, and most importantly, heard. Over time, their connection deepened. They shared stories, cooked meals together, and yes, eventually shared their vulnerabilities, physically and emotionally. But it was all on their own terms, slow, considerate, and full of understanding. There was no performance, no expectations, and no shame about the limitations that came with aging. Margaret once told her daughter Claire, who had recently gone through a divorce, "Sweetheart, being satisfied in bed isn't about what you do. It's about how you feel. It's not about age or size or technique. It's about trust. And when you find that, everything else just falls into place. Claire had stared at her mother in surprise, before bursting into laughter. "Mom, I can't believe you just said that." But Margaret smiled. "Well, it's true. And nobody ever tells you that. We spend our lives thinking youth is where desire lives. But real satisfaction? That's something you earn. It deepens with time." In the years that followed, Margaret and Harold continued their companionship. Sometimes he would sleep over, sometimes not. There were no labels, no rules. Just comfort and understanding. Margaret found satisfaction not only in those quiet nights with Harold, but in the freedom to be herself, in the way her body had softened, in the lines that traced her face, and in the memories that filled her heart. Her days were filled with simple joys, a warm bath, a favorite book, the way sunlight filtered through the curtains in the morning. She didn't need anyone to complete her because she had finally become whole. In a society obsessed with youth and beauty, Margaret stood as a gentle reminder that aging is not the end of desire, it is the evolution of it. While the world tries to hide the aging body or treat it like it's broken, Margaret celebrated hers. Not because it looked like it once did, but because it carried her through everything: grief, birth, laughter, and yes, love. She began to speak at local community gatherings about aging and joy. Once, during a Q&A session, a young woman nervously asked, "Can you really still enjoy life, intimately, at your age?" Margaret chuckled, then leaned toward the microphone. "Let me tell you something," she said, eyes twinkling. "True intimacy is not about age. It's about how comfortable you are in your own skin and how kind someone else is to that skin. And when you get to a point where you no longer chase approval, but instead accept and celebrate your story, that's when the magic really begins." The audience applauded, some smiling, others wiping away tears. Her words were honest and needed. What satisfied Margaret wasn't just Harold's company or the warmth of a shared blanket. It was the deep peace she had found with herself. She had learned to forgive her past, embrace her present, and welcome the future, whatever it may bring. So, when people asked, "What satisfies a 70-year-old woman in bed?" the answer wasn't what they expected. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a scandal. It was trust. It was companionship. It was self-love. And in a world that often forgets the elderly in these conversations, Margaret became a quiet voice reminding everyone that love, touch, and joy have no expiration date. She remained a beacon of truth in a society that clung too tightly to the myths of youth. She knew the truth, and she lived it every single day.